This program is part of our One Book, One Community partnership that we're doing with the College of William and Mary. And this year's selection was stamped by Jason Reynolds. We have tonight Dr. Natoya Haskins, Associate Professor of Counselor Education and Director of Diversity and Inclusion for the William and Mary School of Education. She has focused much of her research on culturally responsive counselor education experiences for graduate students of color, as well as strategies to support the advancement of students and professionals in the field. Her teaching centers on providing a collaborative educational experience that embraces culturally diverse perspectives and historical and contemporary social justice issues within school counseling and counselor education. We're thrilled to have you with us this evening, Dr. Haskins, and are looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to also introduce the rest of our presenters tonight before we get started. We have Dr. Janise Parker, who is an assistant professor of school psychology.
Hey, everyone.
And her area of expertise is social cultural factors and positive youth development among Black students, cultural responsive behavioral and mental health services, religious spiritual diversity among minoritized youth. And then we have two of our doc students who are with us, Unity Walker as well as Aiesha Lee. Both of them have experiences and do research in the area of social justice issues, trauma, race-based issues, transpersonal issues. And so we're so happy to have them be a part of our presentation tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. One of the things I do want to note is we will be taking questions throughout, and we encourage you to put the questions in the chat, and we will take moments where we pause and answer the questions instead of waiting to the end. However, you can wait to the end. We will have, we hope to have some time at the end for a few questions as well. So I'm going to just start off by giving you a list of what we hope to accomplish tonight and what we're calling our objectives. So first, we will define race and racism. We will then go into a little more depth and discuss race and racism in schools. We will identify what children tend to know already about race and racism. We will explore the benefits of talking about race and racism with your child. And then we will describe the developmental needs as they relate to race and racism. And then finally, what most people have come for is we'll provide age-appropriate strategies for talking about race and racism. So I like to start off presentations with using narratives or stories in some way. And so when we were preparing for this presentation, one of the stories that came to mind was Antiracist Baby. And the reason why, I'm going to read just a very small snippet of it. We wanted to include it because we see this also as another strategy. If you are trying to decide, you know, where do I start? This book is really a good place to start. It is designed for, you know, 1 to 2 year olds all the way up to adults. And so if you are trying to support children that are preschool, but you also want to support children that are in middle school and elementary school and high school and around talking about race, this is kind of a good place to start. So I am going to switch my screen really quickly because I want to actually show you, I think the photos within the book are beautiful as well. And I think it helps to tell the story to actually see the pages. Oh, no. Let me try that again. Let's see. All right, so I'm not going to read the entire thing, so I would encourage you to, it's very short, but I would encourage you to either get a copy from the library or to purchase one yourself. All right. Okay, I did practice this. Okay, there we go. So, anti-racist baby. Anti-racist baby is bred, not born. Anti-racist baby is raised to make society transform. Babies are taught to be racist or anti-racist. There's no neutrality. Take these 9 steps to make equity a reality. Open your eyes to all skin colors. Use your words to talk about race. Point at policies as the problem, not people. Shout, there's nothing wrong with people. Celebrate all of our differences. Knock down the stack of cultural blocks, literally. Confess when being racist. Grow to be an anti-racist. And believe we shall overcome racism. So like I said, I think that's a good place to begin the conversation. We will utilize that as a stepping place into our discussion. And we will have Aiesha start us off.
Hello, good evening. I am excited to be here and speak with you all tonight, and I thank you guys for inviting us. So I will go ahead and just briefly talk about what race is. We've heard race, the term thrown around quite a bit. And so I'll just read right off of this slide. Race is a social construct. So I'll stop there already and say that, social construct is a huge piece of what race is. It's not something that is biological. It's not something that's scientific. It is a social construct that people, and we all know how fallible we are or how imperfect we are as people. So people, we made this idea of race up. So a social construct that artificially divides people into distinct groups based on certain characteristics, such as physical appearance, particularly skin color, ancestral heritage, cultural affiliation, cultural history, ethnic classification, racial categories, subsume or include ethnic groups. So basically, it was created as a way to kind of know where people belong and don't belong. And that is already, we have a problem with that. So I'll let that sit there.
And so the notion of race is something that, like Aiesha said, it's a social construct. But our children begin to understand that construct at a very early age. And so I'm going to give you a very brief narrative, an exchange that happened between my son and I when he was in kindergarten. He came home one day and I said to him, why the sad face? Because he looked like, something had happened. And he said, Mom, am I colored? And I kind of paused and I said, what? Because I was like, I wasn't quite sure that he'd asked that. And he said it again, Mom, am I colored? And I said, what would make you ask that? Did something happen? What happened? And he said, one of the kids in my class said I was colored. And I kind of paused and I said, what? To try to understand maybe what was going on in the class. And he said, you're colored. This is what the other child said to my son. He said, you're colored. And he started laughing. And I said to him, well, it's not something to laugh about. Black is beautiful. And I also said we don't use that term colored, but it was used back in the 60s, the 50s, the 40s, to describe African Americans here in the United States. And I tell that story because I think it's important to understand that while, sometimes it's difficult to begin these conversations, children are already being confronted with notions of race at an early age. And Unity is going to talk a little bit more about what racism is.
Yeah, so we talked about race being this social construct that emerges, and really this sort of thing is a pattern of our brains just recognize, or is a byproduct of our brains recognizing patterns, putting people into categories, and this sort of thing. But what it does is when we're creating these categories is it begins to conceptualize people based on their differences. So better than, less than, ranking people higher and lower, and that sort of thing. And it emerges as this cultural phenomenon that we know as racism. And racism, when we think about racism, we think about like the KKK, we think about slavery, we think about these egregious actions that individuals take that actively harm people, that involve people being killed and those sorts of things. But it's more complex than that. The way that we're going to talk about racism is it's more of a structural thing, right? And so when we look at our definition here, it starts by talking about the systemic subordination of members of targeted racial groups who have relatively little social power in the United States. When we think about that, we think about where this discrepancy in social power comes from. We think about the history of the country. We think about the ways in which our environmental contexts essentially inform the allocation of resources, and we think about the dominant narratives that have driven the country, and that creates the systemic subordination. We take that and then we put the end on it here, where we have the members of the agent racial group who have relatively more social power creating that subordination. So in this context, that is white Americans. So in this way, we have white Americans creating a system of racism. And it's something that was created when the country was founded, right? Through the slave trade practices, through the discriminatory laws after slavery ended, and through the way that we have allocated resources. We have created structural racism. And this environmental context informs the way that people's minds operate, the ways in which we can categorize people as different based on their skin color and based on different physiological characteristics. And then when this happens, we then look at this structure that we have that says, okay, these people are superior, they have more resources, and we start to see patterns of discrimination. We're used to seeing things that we would call overt racism. And that is, hate speech, lynching, hate rallies, any sort of like racially motivated violence. That's something that's very big. We see a lot in police brutality and that sort of thing. Overt hate groups, like all of the white supremacist movements that exist in the country, we see those as overtly racist acts. But because this is a structural thing, this goes on beneath the surface. And this is where individuals who claim to not be racist are still complicit in the system of racism. So long as somebody benefits from a structural system, they play a role in the discrimination against people of color, and specifically Black people in this context, right? So when we look at what we call covert racism, we have this idea that individuals can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But when we look at the distribution of resources, the opportunities allocated based on race, there's discrepancies there. When people say that they don't see color, that's denying the lived experience of other individuals, right? And because they do have the lived experience as a person of color, and again, in this specific context, as a Black person. And when we deny that, we contribute to this racial oppression that goes on, that comes out in racist jokes and saying that, well, I didn't intend to do this. The intentions that you perform are one thing, but what underlies that often is this idea that because your intentions were not racist, that you were not racist, right? And so the intentionality is such a big piece in this that people try to use to defend themselves as not racist. But the ignorance to one's own behavior and how it affects marginalized populations around them is essentially where the intentions create racism, right? And when we don't realize the way in which our actions contribute to oppression, we can claim ignorance and we can say that our intentions were good, but we're still participating in that racist system. The other way in which that is experienced is through just a lack of tolerance for this experience. So the people in the positions of power essentially say that that they're not racist because they haven't built the stamina to see what it is that people of color go through on a day-to-day basis. Specifically in the context, white people don't have the experience of Black people in this country. And because Black people have an experience that contributes to them seeing this every day, recognizing these patterns, they've built a lot of tolerance, they've built a lot of understanding, and that's something that we don't see in people in positions of power. And when that happens, they can turn a blind eye and even be silent, which contributes to racism. So.
Now I'm going to talk a little bit about why should we even have these conversations with our children. And as I go through this presentation, the biggest thing you'll see is that they're trying to fill in the blanks themselves. And so as adults, as parents in particular, we have to be intentional about those conversations. So when it comes to students' experiences with race and racism in school, given that school is a place where most of our kids spend a great chunk of their time, we know that racism impacts school bonding, from student to student, student to teacher, student to administrators. We know that it can impact student self-esteem, and I'm specifically talking about students of color here. So we know that it can particularly impact their self-esteem in terms of them just doubting themselves, feeling afraid, worry. And we also know from a systemic level that racism in schools does lead to inequitable achievement, school discipline, and even opportunities for students to access things like rigorous college courses, get that education, which we know propels them to be on track for a college education, and that can kind of further follow them even beyond the school setting. So again, as I mentioned before, by the age of 3, children can express explicit forms of racial bias. By the age of 5, we know that children of color are typically conscious of existing racist stereotypes about their group, and they're negatively affected by them. By age 8, we know that white kids generally learn that it is socially unacceptable to express those more explicit forms of racial bias. So if you kind of go back to that iceberg at the top of the iceberg, but they actually tend to, in general, right? We know there's always exceptions. In general, they tend to exhibit maybe those more implicit forms of prejudice and racism. So I also had a conversation with my son, and he's currently 4. And this happened last semester. And he came home from daycare and he said, Mommy, guess what? And I said, what? He said, there's someone in my class who is brown just like me. And I said, really? That's great. And another student is brown like me too. And I said, wow. And his reaction was, and brown is good, right? And of course, I said absolutely in an affirmative. But again, as Dr. Haskins mentioned before, our kids are beginning to develop these schemas around racism. What does that mean for them being different? In particular, having darker skin tones and complexions. And so they're trying to fill in the blank based on what they're seeing around them through different forms of information. So this is just, again, an overview. And I'm not going to read everything word for word. But we know because our kids are trying to fill in the blanks, right? When it comes to white students first, we know that they speak about race and racism in various ways. At times, they may speak about it in a colorblind way. So again, going to the bottom of that pyramid, things we don't see. Sometimes they speak about it in a way that denies that racism even exist. And so here are some sample quotes from prior research that was conducted with adolescents, in particular white adolescents, around the way that they conceptualize racism. And you can see with this quote here at the bottom, this particular student pretty much said, "Oh no, that's a thing of the past." Of referring to the civil rights era. That doesn't happen anymore. Things have changed. Um, we know that students of color tend to speak about race in various ways. Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Haskins.
Okay,
Yes.
sorry.
Mhm. Yeah, so this also just kind of shows just additional misperceptions that white students might have. And in particular, they may begin to fill in the blank with ill-informed stereotypes. So that's, maybe viewing students from a specific group as kind of ascribing to certain types of characteristics based on what they may see in the media. Um, at times, those that maybe move a little bit further in terms of thinking about it holistically may view it as an individual issue. And then some students may also view it as a systemic issue, which is what, in essence, racism is about. And this last quote just shows that. And then we know students of color also speak about race and racism in various ways. However, what we do know in the literature is that students of color overwhelmingly talk about the ways that it impacts them in and out of the school context. So even though they may also express things like, "Oh, we're all the same," so that colorblind rhetoric, they're more likely to talk about how it impacts their mental health, how they're aware of the stereotypes that other kids, teachers, society impose on them, as well as the differential treatment they may experience. And so this particular quote at the bottom really just summarizes all of that, where this was a study conducted with Black students and Latino students. And they mentioned, when I walk into the school building, I feel all these different emotions, the anger, the resentment, the hurt. And I keep saying, "Why are we treated this way?" Because I'm aware of how we're treated because of our skin color. And then again, thinking about that full gamut and the ways in which our students may conceptualize racism, students of color may also talk about it as a systemic issue as well. And this was a quote from a student who I had a chance to work with in some research a few years back um, from the Hampton Roads area. And the student pretty much, acknowledged that denial of opportunities, right, in school. I'm in my AP classes. I'm African American. I'm one of few. It's like that throughout the school. And again, I'm just wondering to myself, why? Why is that the case? So, why does all of that matter, right? Me showing you all of these different sample quotes. Because again, we know that there's a range in which our students are trying to figure out, our kids are trying to figure out, what does race mean? What does racism mean? And so we know that as they continue to develop, they're constantly trying to develop and create ideas and interpret information from various sources. But when we silence kids at a young age for stating something that they see and that they know exist, we make them feel as if talking about racism and having these open conversations is socially unacceptable, when we should be sitting with them to educate them and to help them figure it out. And so, if we're not having these open, candid conversations with our kids as parents, as caregivers, We know that they can get this information from the news, social media, and peers, and that information may not necessarily be accurate. And so that's why we see that full gamut of responses, because they may be getting that ill-informed information from sources that are not necessarily valid, if you will. And so, just to kind of sum this up, why is it important, right? So, talking about racism can help them understand, respect, and appreciate differences. It helps to build empathy and compassion for others. It can help them see when things in the world are unjust and unfair, not just at an individual level, but at a systemic level. And it can begin to empower them to move beyond a simple place of awareness to actually know that they can do something about it and they have a role in addressing racism.
So when we look at the development of race and racism in children, we really want to look at what's going on for them from a developmental perspective. So a lot of developmental theory focuses on cognitive development, social development, moral development, and those sorts of things. And so when we look at the conceptualization of race and racism, it makes sense as to why, especially given the environmental contexts that we have in the United States, that really tell us that racism are these overt acts of discrimination, that it is racially motivated violence, that it is slavery, that it is lynching, all these things that we see as like egregious and racist. For children who aren't as developmentally complex yet, their brains aren't as fully developed, it's easier to see overt racism as something that is racist. And as Dr. Parker was saying, as children get older, we see them move to more covert forms of racism. There's a recognition that overt racism is something that is no longer acceptable. And that covert racism is something that we see with the increasing developmental complexity. And so when we look at the needs, right, like the social development, kids are trying to make friends, they're trying to connect with their caregivers, making sure that they're maintaining these relationships when they're really young. And they also understand what is good and bad. They know if I do this, I will get punished. If I do this, I will get rewarded. They begin to understand that people are making rules and that I'm supposed to follow them and that I have to follow these standards. And in that, they begin to pick up on these messages of their own racial identities and what is or isn't okay in terms of interacting with people of other races. But as they develop and move into adolescence, this gets a little more complex. So moving into adolescence, individuals become more capable of thinking complexly and examining societal values. And so they can look at these issues and say, is this something that I agree with? Does this sit right with me? Do I agree with the role that I'm being given in society? Do I want to follow these rules, or should I adjust my perspectives? Right. And so when having these conversations with adolescents, it can really look different depending on race. And so because racial identity development is something that starts so early on and perceptions of racism start so early on, we see some diverging trajectories based on race. And so for individuals who've experienced this their whole lives, those conversations are going to look different than it would for people who haven't, right? And that's not to say that people can't perceive concepts like prejudice and concepts like discrimination, because that can happen to any person. But the concept of racism is something that is structural and it is based in power and privilege. And that's something that looks completely different based on race and only affects people who are in a marginalized position. And so we can see anger and frustration about issues related to race in adolescence. We can see people trying to really come to grips with their own identity surrounding this. And we can also see a lot of people really starting to move into those more subtle ways that racism exists on a structural level, because they recognize more and more that these covert forms of expression are not acceptable.
So we're going to now move into the strategies and tips on how should we address racism with our children?
So specifically, our children are at different stages in their development, just as Unity was just discussing. And we can break down these stages according to school level. So we have our lower elementary students, which are our little babies. We want to first follow the child's lead, right? We don't want to kind of come into their face and say, hey, this is race, this is racism, and this is everything that you need to know. If the child brings it up, kind of like Dr. Parker and Dr. Haskins' children did, that's when you kind of say, okay, let's sit down and let's discuss this in a manner that is simple, right? But not downplaying it. So it's not to bring it down to, it's just, our skin is just a little different, but it doesn't mean anything. No, it's something serious. But it's, let's break it down in a way that they can understand it. Saying that we're all the same does lead to that color blindness. And so that is definitely something you want to stay away from. While it is very, very admirable to, and it's understandable why a parent would say that to their child, it leads to, again, racist ideals, right? And not really taking into consideration the celebrated differences of people of color and other cultures. Using picture books, just like Dr. Haskins started our presentation with, is really, really great. I mean, especially if you're already reading to your children, and so they're really well versed in, hey, it's time to read book with mom, dad, parent, guardian, whoever. You just pull out that book, make it a normal thing. Normalize it, right? Just like, if we're going to do a bedtime story, this is our bedtime story tonight, and this is something to learn. Buying toys and books that reflect diversity of race and ethnicity, and using fairness as a concept for the children. So if you want to talk about racism, talking about the fairness or unfairness is a very simple idea that lower elementary students can grasp onto. And then we move on to upper elementary students. So being mindful of the previous pieces that we just talked about, depending on developmental level. Again, lower and upper can be very, very different, but they can also kind of go back and forth between each other depending on your child's development. So social media is huge with upper elementary, right? So what are you seeing on social media? What are you thinking about that? What are your peers saying? And so this is an age where you can really start to have more of an open conversation and open dialogue. So it's not so much of, okay, let me, explain this and give you these ideas that you can maybe grasp. It's more of, well, what are you seeing? Let's talk about what you're seeing. Let's break that down. Let's be open. And I like this part too with, oh, I'm sorry, I can't go back. It's okay. I like this part too, where it says be willing to have the conversation, even if it's uncomfortable, because it will be a very, very uncomfortable conversation to have with your children, especially if they're saying something, going back to what Dr. Parker's son said, is brown good? Your child might say that, right? Is brown good? That's uncomfortable to say, like, yeah, it is good. Why wouldn't it be good? But sit with that and be open with that, and modeling, being vulnerable, modeling that it might be uncomfortable, but it's an important topic is really, really important. And using your real life experiences. And then for our older kids, middle and high school students, now you can really, really kind of get into the nitty gritty of things, right? They're not littles anymore where you have to kind of say things simpler and, follow their lead. Here you can kind of just say, because, they've seen it. They're all in social media. They're having these conversations. So let's start out by finding out, what do you even know already? I mean, I know you know something. I know you've heard something. What do you know? What have you heard? Asking questions about race when it's presented on TV or at an event is really a cool way to kind of catch it. There are a lot of things in the media, and we're not even talking about the news. We could just talk about a TV show, a comedy, right, on television, There are a lot of things that are racist on television, the stereotypes, right, that they put people of color in. Maybe bring that up. Like, that's kind of weird. Do you think that that's how all Black people act, right? Do you think that's how all people of color act? And building that conversation from there. Finding diverse experiences are really great. Right now, again, we're in the middle of a pandemic, so it's not like we can just go out on and have these huge cultural experiences. But I have heard of like online museums and online experiences or videos or something like that. Engaging in those diverse things are great. And again, that goes back to that modeling. Okay, you as the parent, you as the leader, are able to engage in these experiences. So then me as a child, I can too. And so I will. Getting involved and then joining a book club. I know the book of the month was stamped, right? So maybe if your middle or high school student can read a book that's similar or the same, and join a book club, that would be a good way to, especially if they're an avid reader, to get them educated and involved.
And then we have some general strategies that parents can utilize for almost every child. Um, the first one is don't freak out. I mean, this is a challenging topic if it's not something that you've talked about with your children before, and they come home and they want to have a discussion, or they mention something, or you hear them say a word that is not culturally responsive or flat out racist, and you know you're like, okay, no, we don't say that. But sometimes it can cause you to freak out and move away from that, it being a teachable moment. So be cool, be calm, and say, let's talk about it. I heard you mention this, and I'm curious where you got that from. Where'd that come from? What does that mean to you? And then talk about why that might be, not appropriate, or here's some better ways to think about that. Or it may not even mean at that moment to have a full on conversation. It could be, let's have some experiences that help to challenge some of those thoughts that you might see kind of emerging. Because we do know that children, especially either, especially middle and high school students, are impressionable. Their peers play a significant role in that. They often are modeling and doing things that their peers are doing, whether they really believe it or not. It may be what they're doing to fit in. And again, have those cultural experiences. So there are so many things. I'll be so happy when we get out of this pandemic, where we can actually, go out. Before the pandemic, one of the things I did with my son was I took him, to a Native American reservation, just so he could actually experience and see, some of the things that we've been talking about. I think he was studying about Native Americans, or something in his classroom about indigenous communities. And I wanted him to have a deeper understanding. And so that was one way to do that. And so utilize those experiences. And it doesn't have to be even something, like that. It could be, going to the library. Our local library has amazing programming for small children, related to race and race issues, and taking advantage of those experiences. And also, when you hear or see racism happening as a parent, call it out, say something about it, have a conversation about it. Don't just kind of let it be and say, oh, that doesn't have anything to do with us, or kind of, you know, brush it under the rug, or act like it's not important. It's important to say that it's not okay. And your children are looking at that. Your children notice when you don't say anything, because what that means to them is, oh, it's not a big deal. And they internalize it exactly that way. So then they grow into that. They grow into those beliefs that, as long as it's not maybe affecting me, then racism isn't a big deal. And I know we've heard that, recently, people saying, racism doesn't exist anymore. It's not a big deal, and so it's important to call it out when you see it. And then model diverse relationships and diverse connections and community. And not just so you can say, I have a friend who's someone of color or someone from an underrepresented population, but to have a true relationship with people, I mean, and I think that's hard to do in some ways if you've never had that experience, if you've been in a whiteout or a all white environment majority of your life, or most of your friend group and your family is white, it may be a challenge. And so you may have to kind of push yourself and work through and figure out why, haven't you had those relationships? What's going on there? And then be willing to kind of grow. Because I think one of the things we hope you all gain tonight is understanding that it's not just about talking to your children. It also is about the parent having to grow to be able to do that. And even as an African American mom, yes, I've experienced racism. I've dealt with racism pretty much my whole life. It still is a challenging conversation to have, even from someone that has had those experiences. So we're not saying it's easy. It's not going to be easy. Some of these conversations will be easier than others. So and then ask questions, keep the dialogue going. We know how important it is, for our children to feel heard, to, make time, whether it be a few minutes at dinner, before they go to bed at night, to ask, how are things going? How are you feeling? I mean, even questions like, who are your friends? What was it like when you went and played with so and so, or had a play date, or went to a birthday party? Find out what the dynamics are like, and how they're engaging. Most of our children, we know this, racism is learned behavior. So typically our little babies, you're not going to see, a lot of that behavior that where they're separating themselves. But we do begin to see it in middle and high school in particular, where you see, a lot of the white children sitting together at lunch in particular, or, all of the black children or brown children, of course, I say all, but it's not always all, of course, but we see those separations happening, and people always wonder why. There's a comfort there, but it's a learned comfort. All of this is socially constructed. And that's the challenge, it's not just by happenstance. We have socially constructed this. Um, and so be willing to ask your child questions, encourage, and create opportunities for them to engage with people that have had different lived experiences that don't look like them. And then be honest about your own growth in areas. If you all have goals and you talk about this, and, you talk about, what are we going to do to really become more, you know, um, to experience different, perspectives, talk about where you are and what you want to get out of this too as a parent. What do you want to learn? And then schedule time to talk often, which I already kind of said, and then reflect on your own personal biases, and then how those might actually be impacting your child and how they're understanding race and race issues and racism. And then here are some personal bias reflection prompts, things that you can ask yourself, but also ask your child. And I don't necessarily want to go through all of them, but I'll go through some because I think it's important for you to kind of hear. Um, the first time I became aware of differences was when, and you can talk about any experience you have had with your child. And then you can also have your child talk about their experience, and just think about how powerful that might be. I mean, and it's, maybe they say, I never really thought about it. And that's just as, great as a conversation where they say, oh, I first learned about it here, or a few years ago. Another one, I'm going to go down to number 4. A time I was mistreated because of my own difference was when, and you fill in the blank. All of these are just kind of conversation starters. Some of them are going to be more difficult to answer. Some of the responses might be, a little deeper than some of the others. but they all are designed to really get the conversation started and to create a different way of engaging around race and racism in your family. And so this presentation will be available and you can go back through some of these. I will read a couple more just for those that might not get a chance to go back through them. I feel most comfortable when I'm around people who fill in the blank. I feel least comfortable when I'm around people who. The memories I have of differences affect my parenting by. And I would encourage all of you, parents in particular, to take time to reflect on some of these, before you have those conversations, before you start, having those conversations with your child about race. Reflect on it for yourself and figure out really where you are. And that really concludes our presentation for tonight. We do have a list of websites here that we think provide some pretty good recommendations, strategies, if you want to continue to develop your toolbox around, talking about race with your child. I would encourage you to take a look at them. We have PBS Kids, we have Kids Health, the Parent Coalition, tolerance.org, Healthy Children, Building Resilience. All of these are websites that are designed developmentally to really support parents as they talk about race. And then we have a list of book websites that have book lists. And start your library, like Dr. Parker said, incorporate it into your reading, your bedtime stories. Encourage your children during the summer to read a couple books that maybe go outside of what they typically would, to help them expand their understandings around race and racism. And thank you. We're going to open it up for any questions that anyone might have. I do see, it looks like a question here in the chat. It says, I'm going to read it, and then anyone in our group can respond. As the parent of two biracial daughters, a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, African American and European American, colorism and hair texture is a major issue in terms of their understanding of their own racial identity. We actively seek out diverse representations in books and want them to fully embrace both their African and European heritage. I wonder whether they will come to resent their European roots given the history and continued racial violence and injustice of European Americans against African Americans. Do you have strategies to address this? Yeah, this is challenging. I've been actually doing some exploring around colorism and ways that children internalize their identities, in particular children that are African American and white. And this is one of those. There's not an easy answer, and I just have to be honest with that. I think because depending on what's happening in the family unit as well, around which race maybe is viewed positively and within our society, and I think what you're saying is right on right now. There is difficulty around trying to have a conversation about white is good. That is still a good part of who you are, when your children might be seeing on TV what's going on, and the violence that's taking place against Black Americans in this country, African Americans in this country. I do think continuing to help them understand and value both parts of who they are, even when it might be difficult, and it might not feel good. I mean, this is one of those things where, there's not a perfect bow that we can put on this to say, okay, do this here, and they're going to feel better about it. But I think you continue to encourage them around both of their racial identity, both racial identities, and provide opportunities where they can embrace their hair texture, and the color of their skin. Our society, we're so skewed with white supremacy. And I use that term not in a political way, but in a way where we're looking at, what is valued and what is not, in our country. And we know that in the United States of America, things that are associated with whiteness are given more value. And while we continue to try to push back against that and say that, we value, you know, Black, people, we value Asian Americans, Latino, Latina um, individuals, it's not actually coming out in how we're engaging, and how our leadership is engaging. Um, and so it's going to be a challenge. But I feel like it sounds like you're on the right path. I don't know if anybody on in any of the other presenters want to chime in.
The only thing that I'll add to that is just to be mindful of developmental level. That being biracial, I'm not biracial, so I can't speak to that, but I can speak to what a biracial child might be going through, because I've counseled a couple of biracial children, and it might take them a while to understand and grapple with the complexity of being a biracial child. They'll have all the emotions, because as a child they can feel very quickly and very easily, but to be able to understand is a whole nother thing. So I think that's really important to remember. If your child is, again, a little, it might be hard for them to understand, well, this is systemic racism. It doesn't mean that you're bad. But once they get older, it might be a little bit easier to be like, well, remember when, and this is what it is. And these are your two parts.
Yeah. It's really challenging. And the hair piece is another, I would go back to that because it's something that I think, being an African American in this country, and this is also, you're seeing this more and more with research, the notion of, how do you talk about hair? What's considered pretty, right? When, oh, we want your hair to be pretty, is that straight? Are we, so you have to be really cautious around the use of that language, even though it may not seem initially like it means anything. It's internalized to mean, that coarse, coily hair is not as good as. And so, and those are things, my daughter's not biracial. Um, but I am still mindful of her developing a love relationship with her hair as is. If she chooses to straighten it, that's fine as she gets older. But I want her to love it and see it as beautiful in its kinky, coily state. And so I try to buy dolls that have coily, not just black dolls, but dolls that have coily hair, because she needs to see that that is a part of a standard that we embrace, and so just those little things may seem little, but I think psychologically what research tells us is that that is becoming a part of the schemas that they come to understand in terms of how they come to understand themselves. So
And one thing I also wanted to add, from a psychological perspective, particularly around the piece of like not wanting to resent the European part of who she is, right? You can also have explicit conversations, again, depending on her age, about who she is as a person versus a systemic issue as a whole, right? So you're not ignoring the systemic racism that's there, um, that, has in large part been imposed by European Americans, but you're also letting her know that that doesn't have to be her story. And so, just as you might pull examples of role models and figures and historical figures of people who are Black and African American, in this case, you might be intentional about pulling examples from European Americans that, maybe stood next to Dr. Martin Luther King, right? That advocated for justice. and equality for all, to show that that can be a part of her story as a European American, and she doesn't have to, I guess, internalize and take on the negative parts, if you will, of that particular part of her identity.
I think so much of it has to do with the way that one looks and the way that one is perceived. So the degree to which one is white passing versus the way that they are, like if they are perceived as Black, right? Because I think colorism is something huge, both within the Black community and in our culture as a whole, right? And so if this is somebody who can be visibly identified as Black, or if your children are, then that is something that they will have to navigate both within Black culture and white culture, right? Because there exists issues of structural oppression that they will still have to deal with being identified as Black, with being treated differently because of the way that they look. But then in Black spaces as well, being aware of the influence and prevalence of colorism, whether that be hair texture, whether that be skin color, anything like that. It can also create conflict and difficulty in that. And so just being cognizant that that's going to be a struggle that's going to be unique to them, that might go beyond either of your experiences, is something that I would just mention, because it's not going to be easy to navigate. But it sounds like you're trying to do the work now to be a supportive and involved parent for these experiences that they're going to go through, right? So.
And if I can jump in and give a really shameless plug, William and Mary does have a great family counseling center. And that might be a really nice place once your children get to that age, if they're really struggling with their identity. It shouldn't be something that they should just kind of figure out on their own. It might be really nice for the whole family to kind of just come in and talk, get help with that from a clinician. So if that's something you're interested in, you can definitely follow up on the William and Mary website.
Thanks again to our presenters. Really interesting information and things that we can use to reflect on our own reactions to racism when we see it happening. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.